The story of Brân ap Llyr begins in a world where myth and early memory blur together, where the coastline of ancient Britain is still carved by tides that carry merchants, raiders, and kings between islands. In this world the people speak of giants not as monsters but as ancestral rulers, beings whose presence shaped the land before written memory existed. Among them stands Brân ap Llyr, known throughout the old traditions as Mabinogion, a figure whose immense size, wisdom, and tragic destiny left an imprint so deep that storytellers preserved it for centuries. The documentary of his life begins long before his final journey, in the halls of Llyr, where he was born into the royal house of Llyr, a lineage connected to the sea itself. Brân's early life was marked by his extraordinary nature. As the people later recounted, he was so large that no building constructed by human hands could contain him. He walked the land with a calm and deliberate presence, his shadow stretching across the stones, his voice carrying over the wind without effort. Yet his size never eclipsed the gentleness of his mind. The people described him as a ruler whose wisdom and diplomacy rivaled his strength. Those who lived under his protection remembered him not as an oppressor but as a guardian whose sense of justice shaped the peace of the island. Growing beside Brân were his siblings, each with a distinct role in the story that would unfold. Brân, his sister, renowned across the lands for her beauty and her dignity. Mabinogion, his brother, a clever and capable figure whose calm nature often balanced the intense personalities around him. Llŷr, quiet and peace-loving, a soft-spoken presence who mediated tensions. And Mabinogion, sharp-tempered and unpredictable, a man whose anger could turn a moment of peace into a storm without warning. These siblings shaped the fate of kingdoms, for their choices would become inseparable from the tragedies that followed. The early seasons of Brân's rule passed with relative peace. Llyr became a center of hospitality, where messengers from distant lands brought news, gifts, and proposals. Traders crossed the sea from Ireland and beyond, telling stories of distant kings who sought alliances with the great house of Llyr. Brân listened carefully to these voices, weighing every proposition with a leader's mind. For although he possessed immense strength, he preferred negotiation to battle. It was said among his people that he would rather solve disputes through dialogue than through the clashing of weapons. 1 year, as the tide carried a fleet from the west toward Llyr, the arrival brought more than simple trade. Among the ships came envoys of Mabinogion, the King of Ireland, who sought to join his kingdom with that of Brân through marriage. The messengers carried elaborate gifts, and they spoke with great respect for Brân's family, especially for Brân, whom Mabinogion wished to take as his queen. In the great open courtyard where Brân received guests, the envoys praised the peace such an alliance would bring. Brân listened, considering the implications for both kingdoms. Brân, for her part, regarded the proposal with calm dignity, understanding the responsibilities placed upon royal daughters of her lineage. Brân accepted the offer. His reasoning was clear and deliberate. A marriage between Brân and Mabinogion would strengthen bonds between the two lands, ensuring shared prosperity and reducing the likelihood of conflict across the sea. A feast was prepared, one grand enough to honor the status of both families. Harps played, fires crackled, and voices rose in celebration. But the harmony of the gathering did not last. Mabinogion, who had not been consulted on the marriage agreement, saw the celebration as an insult to his honor. His temper flared with shocking speed, fueled by resentment rather than reason. In a moment that would alter the course of history, he approached the horses belonging to Mabinogion's party and mutilated them. His action sent a wave of horror through the gathering. The envoys recoiled, torn between fear and outrage. The peace Brân had crafted was shattered in an instant by the reckless fury of his own brother. Brân realized immediately that the stability of his kingdom and the fate of the marriage depended on his response. He approached Mabinogion's envoys with calm gravity, acknowledging the severity of the offense. He offered restitution in the form of precious items and symbolic objects of great value, including a magical cauldron capable of restoring life to the dead. This gift was no ordinary compensation, it was a treasure of immense significance, born of ancient enchantments known only to a few. Madhalwyck accepted the apology, but the sense of unease lingered beneath the surface. Despite the tension, the wedding proceeded. Branwen departed with Madhalwyck's fleet, leaving Britain behind and beginning her life in Ireland. At first, she was treated with respect, and her presence brought harmony to the Irish court. She bore a son named Gwern, whose birth was celebrated as a symbol of unity between the two lands. But peace proved fragile. Stories of Efnission's violent act spread through the Irish court, stirring resentment among Madhalwyck's advisors. Whispers grew into grievances, and grievances escalated into cruelty directed at Branwen. She was forced from her position, made to labor in the kitchens, and subjected to shame that no queen should endure. Branwen bore her suffering with patience, but when the cruelty grew unbearable, she devised a plan to send word to her brother. She trained a starling, teaching it to respond to her voice and carry messages. The bird crossed the sea, braving storms and vast distances, until it reached Bran in Britain. When the giant king received the starling, saw its exhausted wings, and read the message tied to its leg, his heart filled with a heavy sorrow that soon hardened into resolve. The documentary of Bran's life reaches its turning point at this moment. For the peace he had sought to preserve through diplomacy had been violated in a way that demanded response. He gathered his forces, calling warriors from across the land. They prepared ships, provisions, and weapons, knowing the journey ahead would reshape their world. Efnission, aware of the role he had played in the unfolding tragedy, joined the host, though many viewed him with suspicion. Nisian and Manawydan also prepared for the voyage, standing by Bran as loyal brothers. When the armies of Britain set sail, the sea itself seemed to shift under the weight of Bran's towering presence. Tales later told that he waded through the shallows alongside the ships, his height allowing him to walk where others sailed. The journey was long, filled with the sound of creaking wood and wind sweeping across the waves. The soldiers spoke quietly among themselves, aware of the gravity of their mission. This was no raid or conquest. It was the rescue of a sister whose suffering symbolized the breakdown of an entire alliance. Their arrival on the Irish coast sent ripples through the kingdom. The people gathered in alarm, for they had heard rumors of Bran's size but could not comprehend it until they saw him standing on their shores. Madhalwyck, realizing the danger he faced, attempted to restore peace by offering apologies and constructing a massive hall to accommodate Bran's size. But the damage done to Branwen could not be undone with gestures. The tensions between the two sides ran too deep, yet Bran, still seeking to avoid bloodshed, agreed to negotiations. As the new hall was completed, the Irish invited the British host inside. The atmosphere was heavy with cautious hope. But beneath the floors of the hall, hidden by planks and shadows, Irish warriors waited in ambush, their weapons prepared. It was a plan born of fear rather than strategy, a desperate attempt to eliminate the giant king while appearing to make peace. Efnission, drifting among the seats and sensing the tension, discovered the hidden soldiers. His volatile nature took a different turn this time. Instead of igniting conflict without cause, he acted with cold calculation. He crushed the skulls of the concealed warriors before the trap could be sprung. The hall erupted in chaos. The fragile peace collapsed completely. And the final tragedy of Bran ap Llyr began to unfold. The moment the concealed Irish warriors were discovered, the fragile calm inside the hall transformed into an eruption of fear and violence. Shouts filled the air as the Irish guests scrambled away from their benches, the British warriors rose with hands tightening around hilts, and confusion spread like fire across dry brush. Brân, towering above all other figures in the hall, watched the chaos unfold with the sorrowful realization that no act of diplomacy could repair what had been broken. The trust between the two peoples had been fractured beyond repair, and the consequences of that betrayal would echo far beyond the walls of the hall. Mabinogion stood amid the bodies of the ambushers he had killed before they could strike, his breath heavy, his expression torn between triumph and a grim understanding of what was about to happen. For all his temper and recklessness, his act had prevented a slaughter of his own people. But it also meant that open war was now inevitable. The Irish, realizing their plan had failed and fearing the wrath of the giant king, rushed to arms. The British host followed, gripping shields and spears as they prepared to defend themselves. Outside, Brân watched from a distance, her eyes filled with a mixture of dread and helplessness. She had sent for her brother because she could no longer endure the cruelty inflicted upon her, not because she wished for bloodshed between the two lands. Now she stood in the shadow of a conflict vast enough to swallow both kingdoms. Her young son, Llŷr, was too small to understand what was unfolding around him. Brân shielded him from the worst of it, but even a child could sense the tension that crackled in the air. The battle began not with strategy but with eruption. Warriors clashed in the field surrounding the hall. The sound of metal meeting metal echoed across the plains. Brân moved among the fighters with a presence that altered the rhythm of combat itself. Irish warriors scattered at the sight of him, for they had never encountered a being of his scale. He lifted his shield, a massive object crafted specifically for his size, and defended his people while trying, even in the chaos, to minimize unnecessary death. But war has its own mind, and once unleashed, it cannot be easily steered. Matt Hulwick, torn between fear and guilt, attempted to salvage the peace by presenting his son, Llŷr, to the British forces as a gesture of goodwill. He hoped that by placing the child into the care of Brân and Brân, some semblance of harmony might yet be restored. The child, innocent and unaware of the political weight placed upon him, reached out toward his uncle with trust. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the battle might pause, that some spark of reconciliation could still emerge. But Mabinogion stood apart from the scene, his expression dark. His mind, always quick to ignite with violent thoughts, became consumed with jealousy and resentment. He saw Llŷr as a symbol of the alliance that had caused so much suffering. In a fit of rage that would shape the tragedy to come, he seized the boy and cast him into the fire. The scream that followed was not from the flames but from Brân, whose anguish pierced the battlefield with a sound that froze warriors in place. Brân, who had faced storms and armies without fear, felt a sorrow so deep that the world around him seemed to blur. The Irish, witnessing the horrific act, charged with renewed fury. The British, enraged by the murder of the child who symbolized hope, rushed to retaliate. What had been a clash of armies became a storm of raw, unleashed grief. In the heart of this chaos, Brân fought with the weight of tragedy bearing down upon him. Each step he took shook the ground. His voice rose above the clash of weapons, issuing commands meant to protect his people. But even he, with all his size and strength, could not turn the tide of this disastrous battle. The magical cauldron that Brân had given Matt Hulwick earlier, the same cauldron that could restore the dead to life, was brought forth by the Irish. As fallen Irish warriors were placed within it, they emerged again, silent and unfeeling, continuing the fight without hesitation. This unnatural advantage began to overwhelm the British forces. Realizing the danger posed by the cauldron, Mabinogion made a final decision that diverged sharply from the senseless violence he had committed before. Driven by a mixture of guilt and clarity that came too late, he infiltrated the Irish lines. His actions were no longer fueled solely by anger but by a grim understanding that he had set this tragedy in motion. Reaching the cauldron, he threw himself inside, forcing his body against its magical energies. The enchantment sucked the breath from him, tearing him apart, and in the process, the cauldron shattered. The moment it broke, the tide of battle shifted. But Mabinogion's sacrifice, though it slowed the destruction, could not fully save his people. The Irish forces, still vast in number, continued the fight. Brân, wounded by many spears and arrows, moved slowly across the battlefield. The pain radiated through him, but he did not falter. His concern was not for himself but for the survivors among his host. As he made his way toward the shore, the sky darkened with smoke and ash. Warriors on both sides fell in great numbers. The tragedy of the conflict had reached a scale none could have foreseen, shaped by betrayal, misunderstanding, pride, and grief. When the battle finally came to a close, only 7 British warriors remained alive. Among them were Mabinogion, resolute and steady even in devastation, and other loyal figures who had fought by Brân's side. Brân, though alive, felt hollowed by the horrors she had witnessed and the death of her son. The Irish kingdom lay in ruins, and the British forces had been nearly destroyed. Standing at the edge of the water, Brân understood the weight of what had occurred. His wounds were grievous, and he knew he would not return to his homeland in the way he wished. But he instructed the surviving warriors in a calm, steady voice. They were to sever his head from his giant body and carry it back to Britain. Though the command seemed shocking, the warriors obeyed, for they trusted him completely. Once removed, Brân's head remained alive, speaking with clarity and wisdom, providing comfort and advice to his companions. His body, immense and broken, was left on the field of battle as the sea winds swept across it. They set out across the water, carrying Brân's living head with reverence. Brân, her spirit crushed and her heart wounded, traveled with them. During the journey, Brân's voice remained a steady presence, guiding them through sorrow and helping them find moments of peace despite the weight of their losses. But Brân, unable to bear the grief within her, collapsed upon reaching the shores of Britain. She died not from wounds of battle but from a sorrow too deep to endure. The remaining warriors honored her passing with solemn reverence. Brân's head spoke softly, acknowledging her pain and mourning her death. The journey that followed carried the survivors through lands that still bore the memory of Brân's rule. They traveled to Harlech, where they rested, and later to other parts of the island. Wherever they went, the head of Brân continued to speak, maintaining the sense of leadership he had offered in life. Their final destination was the White Mount, where Brân instructed them to bury his head facing the direction of the European mainland. He told them that as long as his head remained there, Britain would be protected from invasion. When the command was carried out, the magic that surrounded Brân's lineage settled into the earth, becoming part of the ancient fabric of the land. The journey of the 7 survivors carrying the living head of Brân ap Llyr marked the beginning of a long passage through landscapes forever changed by tragedy. As they left the coast behind, the wind carried the scent of battle, and the sky seemed dimmer than before. The land felt quieter, as if it sensed that a great presence had been removed from it. Brân's head, though severed from his body, retained the calm authority he carried in life. His voice was gentle yet resonant, guiding the companions onward and urging them to preserve hope even as their numbers had dwindled to so few. The survivors walked along cliff paths and through quiet valleys, each of them haunted by memories of the battle. Mabinogion moved at the front, steady despite the grief that weighed on him. He had always been the thoughtful one among the siblings, and now he felt a profound responsibility to honor his brother's last wishes. The others followed with solemn determination, carrying the head with care. They spoke rarely, and when they did, their voices were muted, softened by exhaustion and sorrow. Only Brann's head seemed untouched by despair, encouraging them whenever the journey seemed endless. Their first refuge was Harlech, where the sea stretched out like a mirror under the pale light. The castle stood strong upon the cliffs, its walls holding memories of gatherings, feasts, and the harmony that had once defined Brann's rule. When the companions entered the hall, it felt eerily empty. The absence of Brann's towering figure made the space seem vast and hollow. Still, when they placed his head upon a cushion and arranged themselves around him, a familiar warmth returned to the room. Brân spoke to them of resilience, of the importance of preserving stories, culture, and unity even in the aftermath of devastation. In Harlech they remained for many years. The time they spent there was unlike any other period in their lives. They felt no aging, no burden of passing seasons, as though the place had slipped beyond the ordinary measure of time. They feasted, spoke, laughed, and remembered the past with clarity. Brann's head nourished their spirits, its presence easing all cares. The hall became a sanctuary, suspended between grief and comfort. Outside, storms would batter the coast, but inside, the companions experienced peace deeper than they had ever known. Eventually, the time came to leave Harlech. Brann's voice, though still calm, guided them onward. They journeyed eastward to an island they later called the Island of the Mighty. There, once again, they entered a state beyond ordinary life. They lived through carefree years, untouched by sorrow or aging, yet not trapped in forgetfulness. Each moment felt vivid, filled with camaraderie. Brann's head continued to share wisdom and stories, recounting memories of his reign, the lessons of diplomacy, the importance of unity, and the dangers of pride and anger. His voice reminded them that even in loss, a people must hold fast to the values that sustain them. Among the seven, Mabinogion absorbed these lessons with particular depth. His calm nature grew even more grounded, and the responsibility of leadership settled upon him almost without his noticing. The others likewise transformed. Their bond strengthened, shaped by shared memories and Brann's steady presence. The brutality of war faded in their minds, not erased but softened by the constant reassurance Brân offered. It was said that laughter flowed freely in those days, and that no sorrow could intrude. Yet they all knew the time in this enchanted peace could not last forever. After many such years, they left the island and journeyed to Gwales, near the western sea. The hall they found there was magnificent, its walls bright and its chambers wide. A great door stood at one end, closed tightly. Brân warned them not to open it, for beyond it lay the world of sorrow from which they had temporarily been shielded. They obeyed his warning and settled within the hall. Life resumed just as it had in Harlech and the Island of the Mighty. Their days passed without grief. The air felt warm, the sea gentle. Music filled the hall, laughter flowed, and Brann's voice echoed as though it were a living presence within the walls. The enchantment over Gwales was deep. None of the companions aged or wearied. They forgot all the hardships that had scarred their hearts. It was as if they lived in a perpetual moment of peace, free from responsibility, free from memory, free even from time. This illusion endured for as long as the door remained closed. The presence of Brann's head ensured the stability of the enchantment, and the survivors continued to live within a world carefully shielded from grief. But enchantments, no matter how strong, can be fragile. One day, curiosity, or perhaps restlessness, overcame one of the companions. He approached the forbidden door and placed his hand upon it. Though he hesitated, the pull of what lay beyond became too strong. He pushed it open. The moment the door swung outward, a violent wind rushed in. The enchantment shattered. The weight of memory crashed over them with brutal force. Every death on the battlefield, every cry of loss, every moment of pain returned to them all at once. The warmth of the hall vanished, replaced by the cold air of grief and awareness. The laughter that had once echoed in the chamber became impossible to recall without sorrow. Brand's head, which had been the center of peace and companionship for so many years, fell silent. The magic sustaining it and the comfort it brought weakened under the weight of returning memory. The companions, hearts heavy once more, looked toward Brand's head with reverence, realizing that their time in this sanctuary was ending. The silence of the head did not diminish their loyalty or their sense of duty. Instead, it strengthened their resolve to fulfill Brand's final command. Leaving Gwales, they journeyed toward London. The roads were long, and the world around them seemed sharper now that they had returned fully to the realm of human experience. Their memories burdened them, yet they moved with quiet purpose, carrying Brand's head as though carrying the heart of their homeland. The land itself felt aware of their passage, whispering through ancient forests and rolling across fields that had known their ancestors. When they reached the White Mount, they prepared for the burial of the head. The atmosphere was solemn. Mabinogion directed the preparations with calm, though his eyes reflected the grief of one who had lost not only a brother but a world they had all shared. The others assisted with steady hands. The earth was prepared, the last words spoken in low voices carried by the wind. When they finally laid Brand's head facing the direction of the continent, a deep stillness settled over the hill. It was said that as long as the head remained buried there, no enemy from across the sea could set foot on the island. The guardianship of Bran would endure beyond death, woven into the protective spirit of Britain itself. When the earth finally settled over the place where Bran's head had been laid to rest, a deep sense of stillness surrounded the 7 survivors. They stood on the White Mount in silence, feeling the weight of the moment. The burial was not only the closure of their long journey from Ireland but also the final fulfillment of Bran's last request. The land around them seemed to recognize the significance of what they had done. The air grew calm, and the wind's voice softened into something like a quiet acknowledgement. Britain now bore within its soil the protective presence of its greatest guardian. The survivors lingered for a while before leaving the hill. None wanted to be the first to turn their back on the resting place of the head that had spoken to them for so many years, comforting them, guiding them, and offering wisdom through the darkest days. When they finally descended from the hill and left the White Mount behind, the world felt strangely empty. The presence of Bran had shaped their lives in ways they could scarcely measure. Now, even though his protection still radiated from the land itself, they felt the absence of his voice like a hollow space within their hearts. As they made their way back through the countryside, they found that the land had changed in subtle ways. The villages they passed seemed more subdued, the people more cautious. News of the disaster in Ireland had reached Britain, and stories of the great battle had spread quickly, taking on exaggerated and distorted forms. Some people spoke of an entire army swallowed by the sea. Others whispered that Bran's body had turned to stone upon the shoreline. Still others claimed that he walked again in visions that came to shepherds at night. Though the stories differed, they all carried the same tone of loss, awe, and uncertainty. The survivors listened quietly, knowing they had witnessed the truth behind the tales, a truth far heavier than rumor could convey. Mabinogion took on the role of leader among the survivors, not through authority but through the calm wisdom he had always possessed. His voice steadied the group as they sought to understand what their lives might look like now. They were 7 who had lived through enchantments beyond ordinary human experience, 7 who had traveled with the living head of a giant king, 7 who had witnessed kingdoms fall and alliances crumble. Now they had returned to a land trying to reshape itself after great loss. They dispersed slowly, for each felt drawn back to the lives they had left behind. But the world they returned to no longer felt familiar. Those who had survived battles expected aging faces, but they found themselves unchanged by time, and those who had remained at home did not know how to comprehend such a return. Every place they visited carried echoes of memories from before the war, stirring emotions both painful and tender. The survivors themselves felt older in spirit, even if their bodies had not aged. Mabinogion wandered for a time, preferring solitude to leadership. He had always possessed a quiet strength that rooted him in patience rather than ambition. The tragedies he had witnessed deepened that patience into something broader and more enduring. He traveled across lands that once bustled with life but now seemed touched by a quiet melancholy. He found solace in simple work, engaging with the rhythms of daily life and trying to rebuild a sense of purpose after so much loss. The others found their own paths. Some attempted to return to their homesteads, reconnecting with family and community. Yet they all shared the silent understanding that they belonged to a world partly set apart from ordinary life. Their experiences had carved deep lines into their spirits, shaping them into bearers of a story that no one else could fully grasp. They carried the memory of a giant king whose wisdom had shaped their homeland, whose fall had torn their world apart, and whose protection continued invisibly beneath their feet. Brân's memory haunted them all. Her gentleness, her dignity, and the unbearable sorrow she carried had become symbols of the fragile peace that once existed between Britain and Ireland. People spoke softly of her, telling stories of her beauty and poise, and her grave became a place of quiet reflection. She had been a bridge between two kingdoms, destroyed by the recklessness of others, yet remembered as a figure who endured suffering with grace beyond measure. Across the sea, Ireland struggled to rebuild. The great battle had left the land scarred. Fields lay deserted. Halls that once housed kings now stood in ruin. The memories of both hope and devastation clung to the people. The death of Llŷr, innocence lost in the midst of political pride and fury, became a warning passed down among generations. Some believed the spirits of the fallen roamed the battlefields on stormy nights. Others said the sea itself murmured the names of those who had died, as if refusing to let their stories fade. In Britain, the legend of Brân ap Llyr began to grow. With each retelling, he became larger than life, not only in physical size but in spirit. People said that he had once stood so tall his footsteps shook the earth. Others claimed he could speak with birds, or that he commanded the tides. What remained constant in every version was his deep sense of justice and his unwavering desire to protect his people. His burial on the White Mount transformed into a myth of guardianship, a symbol of a king whose vigilance endured beyond death. Years became decades, and the landscape changed. New kings rose, new halls were built, new conflicts stirred. Yet the memory of Brân lingered beneath everything, woven into the culture and consciousness of the land. Storytellers continued to speak of him, passing down tales of his strength, his diplomacy, his sorrow, and his sacrifice. Children listened wide-eyed to stories of the giant king whose head had protected the island long after his body had fallen. Warriors invoked his name before battles, hoping his spirit would lend them courage. Poets compared the steadfastness of noble leaders to the unwavering presence of Brân, but not all tales remained bright. Some versions spoke of a later king who, out of arrogance or insecurity, unearthed Brân's head from the White Mount. In these darker stories, the moment the head was removed, the protective magic disappeared, and Britain became vulnerable once again. These versions served as warnings about pride, leadership, and the consequences of breaking sacred trust. Whether or not such events ever occurred became lost to time, but the legend itself endured because it spoke truths deeper than history. Generations passed, and the characters of the tragedy became woven into the mythic fabric of the land. Mabinogion became a symbol of uncontrollable fury, a figure used to caution against pride and reckless impulse. Llŷr, his gentler twin, symbolized peace-seeking hearts caught in the shadow of violence. Branwen became the embodiment of dignity in suffering. Mabinogion grew into a figure representing patience, resilience, and wisdom gained through quiet endurance. And Brân Llyr remained the towering presence at the heart of it all, a reminder of leadership marked by strength, compassion, and sacrifice. The story survived because it carried more than loss. It held within it the pulse of a people who sought to understand their place in the world, who asked why kingdoms rose and fell, why peace could be so fragile, why individuals could shape the fate of nations. It offered a way to mourn tragedies long past and reflect upon the choices that had shaped them. As the ages shifted from ancient memory to medieval manuscripts, the story of Brân found its home in the Mabinogion, preserved not only as myth but as the echo of a deeper cultural truth. Scholars, poets, and storytellers revisited it, each finding new meaning in the choices and consequences woven through the tale. The giant king who could not fit inside any hall became a symbol of ideas too vast to be contained, the weight of responsibility, the complexity of leadership, the cost of protecting one's people, and the enduring nature of sacrifice. Even now, standing on the White Mount in imagination, one can feel the echo of Brân's presence. The land remembers him. The wind that sweeps across the hills seems to carry his steady voice. The stories that survive are not mere remnants of the past, but living reminders of a figure whose legacy spans the boundary between legend and history. The documentary of his life continues to resonate because it captures the timeless themes of unity and division, love and grief, betrayal and redemption, and so the journey that began in the halls of Harlech ends not in silence but in the perpetual storytelling of a people who refuse to let their history fade. Brân Llyr lives on in every retelling, standing tall across centuries, a guardian whose presence shaped a kingdom and whose memory endures through the living tradition of myth. The final echo of his story is not one of sorrow but of remembrance, for as long as the tale is told, the giant king remains a watchful protector woven into the ancient spirit of the land.